Hey everybody, welcome back to World History. Today we're going to talk about three new empires, three new peoples that emerge in the large ancient empires that we've discussed, and how exactly they get along with the people they just conquered. We'll be talking about the Germans in Western Europe, the Arabs in Africa and the Middle East, and the Sui and Tang dynasties in China. Now, each of these groups has the difficulty of being kind of a new formation in the region. The Germans emigrate into Europe from beyond the Rhine River. The Arabs take over a huge chunk of territory from Iran to Spain, even though they only used to live on the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia. And the Sui Dynasty has to deal with merging Chinese culture and Turkish culture in a new way that hadn't been done before. These three groups use three techniques. They kind of play from the same playbook, although they have different needs, so they do it a little bit differently. The first is appealing to local tradition, and we'll discuss that first. Next, they use religion as a way to kind of make connections with the people in their territory. Then finally, investing in infrastructure, and you could also consider investing in expansion, a form of that as well. So when we talk about imitating the tradition of the people they conquer, we see really strong traditions of that in Europe. I mean, if you look around at government buildings even today, imitating Roman styles is very common, but in the Middle Ages, we see the same thing, but it doesn't look very Roman to us because they're imitating late Roman architecture. And this is a great example of what late Roman architecture looks like. This is the Cathedral of San Vitale in Ravenna. This was built by the Roman Emperor Justinian. And it's very interesting because it has 8 walls. It's an octagonal structure. And the Romans really liked using polygonal buildings because they allow more walls, which allows for more windows, which allows for more light to get into their buildings. And also notice the use of mosaic tiles. This was the art form par excellence of the late empire, and they were really talented at it. So what we see are Germans and Arabs imitating this architecture style. So here, for example, is one of the most famous buildings in the Arab world, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which was built under the Umayyad Caliphate in 691. The other big example of imitating local traditions from Europe and the Islamic world is copying Roman law. The law codes of Europe still today are mostly founded upon Roman traditions because when the Germans invaded and took over parts of the Roman Empire, they actually just copied Roman law and made it into their local law. So with the exception of England, pretty much every European country uses Roman law as the basis of their law code. The next thing we should discuss is using religion to merge cultures. So here you can see the 5 pillars of Islam. They're also discussed in the Crash Course World History episode for today. But one of the interesting things you should know when you read through these is that it's actually not asking a lot. There isn't any confusing theology. There isn't any burdensome obligations, despite how you might feel about fasting. It's very simple stuff to follow. There's no confusing legalistic, if you feel like doing this, then do that kind of stuff that you get in Paul. So it's actually really easy to follow Islam. And at the same time, the one thing that Islamic conquerors really care about is that the people they conquer practice monotheism. So if you practice monotheism, you're going to get along well with the Arabs. That means that Christians and Jews, in general, got along well with the people who conquered them. As a matter of fact, they received less persecution under the Arabs than they did under the Byzantine and the Roman Empire. So minority groups of Christians, like Coptic Christians, actually supported the Arab expansion and liked when the Arabs conquered territory like Alexandria, and you can see that in the readings for this week. They were also treated fairly well. They had a collection of rights that we see preserved in the Pact of Umar, again in your readings. Now, there are a lot of hardships too. I don't want to overlook the fact that they were still not as well treated as Muslims, but they still had a lot of rights, a lot more rights than a typical conquered person would have. Germans did something very similar. They took over the Roman Empire, and when they first invaded Rome, they practiced a form of Christianity called Arianism. Instead of promoting tolerance, they actually went a step further and converted to the version of Christianity most common in Western Europe, which is Roman Catholicism or Roman Christianity. In China, their needs were a little bit different. They are the indigenous group reconquering territory from Turkish invaders during the Sui Dynasty. Because remember, China was divided up into a few different big kingdoms. The Sui Dynasty finally reunites it, but they need to make nice with the people who had big armies and were very violent. One of the ways they do that is by adopting Buddhism as a very important part of Chinese culture. So you see leaders of the Sui and the later Tang Dynasty supporting Buddhism, and you see a really good example of that in front of you, the Longmen Grottos, which is right outside of the Tang Dynasty capital, Luoyang, and it was funded by Tang Dynasty leaders like the incredible female emperor Wu Zetian. Here you can see a closer image of what this looks like. The Longmen Grottos were used for hundreds of years and have well over 100 individual grottos that serve as kind of chapels or sanctuaries for Buddhists to go and kind of meditate with their favorite bodhisattva. Now, this ends up being something of a double-edged sword for the Sui Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty because Chinese people have always been uncomfortable with Turkish people in the Middle Ages. And there's a major battle in the Tang Dynasty called the Anlu Shan Rebellion that kills over 35 million Chinese people, which is about 2/3 of the population. After that battle, this policy of toleration and this policy of adapting outside religions is abandoned. And the Chinese had to resort even more strongly towards respecting earlier traditions. And they try to rid China of Buddhism. They go back even heavier on Confucianism. And even later, we see an even more conservative version of Confucianism called Neo-Confucianism emerging. But we'll discuss that in a couple of weeks. The final aspect of these empires I want to talk about is the use of investment, especially investment in infrastructure. The Sui Dynasty's greatest achievement was building the Grand Canal, which linked the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. It's over 1,000 miles long, and on average, it's 130 feet wide throughout. So this is a huge building project. And it helps link basically a water highway between the two big regions of China. This took a lot of work. 5 million people worked on the canal and 2 million of them died, which is obviously an OSHA nightmare. But for the Chinese, it was worth it. It's also one of the reasons why the Sui Dynasty didn't last very long. People weren't very fond of sending their sons and cousins and children off to die building a giant ditch. So the Sui Dynasty only lasted a couple of decades and instead was replaced by the Tang Dynasty fairly quickly. In the Islamic world, you see a lot of investment in trade as well, especially in roads that connect Mesopotamia with Persia and from Persia to Central Asia. These roads then link into the Silk Road. And what we see is both Arab empires and the Tang Dynasty of China expanding along these roads into Central Asia. And as a matter of fact, they met in battle in 755 at Talas River, which is located in modern Afghanistan. So this is a huge event in history. For the first time, we see a Western army and an Eastern army meeting in battle. And it's essentially a stalemate, although the Chinese aren't very happy with the result. And that's what leads to that rebellion that I discussed a couple of slides earlier. That reveals one final thing about these three processes. They are very common and they work pretty well, but when they don't work, they have a high risk. It costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of capital, social capital, to kind of invest in expansion, to invest in infrastructure, to kind of tolerate or change religion. So it often backfires. And one of the places we see it backfire the most is probably in Europe, where it's impossible for German people to come together to link infrastructure until perhaps the Viking invasions, which create a huge trade network throughout Europe that links with the Islamic world through the Mediterranean. And only after that time do we see Germans and Normans investing in connections outside of Europe again.